In today's session, we're going to be looking at zero trust, right? But in specific, we're going to be looking at zero trust from the perspective of the open group, right? And in this section, we're going to be looking at some principles like all zero trust have. But what open groups kind of like presents that's unique to them is they introduce something called the commandments, right? So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, right? So to kind of like start off here, when we're looking at the open groups zero trust kind of like approach, it's kind of like looking at things like it's kind of like thinking here that you're going to assume there's going to be failure, right? So at some point there's going to be some kind of failure, but at the same time we're going to assume that there's always going to be success, right? There's going to be stuff that's going to be working as well, right? And also, it kind of advocates simplicity, right? And this is just a general theme in security that things has to be simple. If security becomes too complicated or complex, then it becomes a barrier, right? And also, open group kind of like states that zero trust isn't a one-time thing, right? It's actually a continuous journey. It's something you're evolving over time, right? So when we look at zero trust, we look at open group, right? We think about immediately the the zero trust commandments, right? And really, the zero trust commandments are built upon the zero trust core principles we'll get to in a minute, right? And these commandments are essentially a list of criterias for achieving zero trust, right? And at the same time, it also provides a clear definition or what zero trust is, right? So let's kind of like think about this as we look at each of these different commandments, right? So the first one is validate trust explicitly, right? So what we're really doing here is we're doing things like we're verifying access control, we're verifying the actual app development, we're verifying the actual supply chain, right? And we're also verifying host configurations, right? So that's kind of like some of the things that we're doing within this commandment, right? The next one is enabling modern work, right? And essentially what this is kind of like doing securely work anywhere kind of concept, right? So providing education, awareness, and enabling that employee to be able to work anywhere at any time, really, essentially, right? The next one is enabling pervasive security, securing assets by value, right? So if we look at the assets within the organization, they all don't have the same value. They have different value, right? So there's some that's critical, there's others that's not so critical, right? And we want to apply security based on that value. So obviously when something is critical, we want to add more security to that as opposed to something that's not critical to our organization, right? The next commandment here is implementing asset-centric controls, right? So this is kind of like, again, from the previous commandment, like thinking about the asset, right? And thinking which kind of security controls that are more appropriate to that specific asset, right? The next one is enabling simple and sustainable security, right? So it's always kind of like keeping it basic. I like to use the motto, keep it simple, keep it basic, right? The next commandment here is utilizing least privilege, right? So this is really kind of like giving access or giving permissions to a user only for them to do their job, right? So when we think about least privilege, we're thinking in terms of just-in-time access, just enough access, adaptive access, some of the topics that we discussed during that Microsoft Zero Trust module, right? The next one we want to do is we want to improve continuously, right? So really, as we are on this journey, as we're moving along, we want to continuously make things better. And then the kind of like the final commandment here is make informed decisions, right? And in order for us to make informed decisions, we're looking at telemetry, at data, at metrics, everything we're collecting from that kind of like logging and monitoring kind of aspects of it, right? The next actual aspect here is the core principles, right? And when we look at the kind of core principles here, they act as like kind of like a fundamental guidelines to doing zero trust and kind of implementing zero trust architectures, right? And these core principles are kind of like grouped into themes, and you'll see these kind of like labeled in the green boxes. So let's look at these core principles and the themes. So the first kind of theme is organizational value and risk alignment, right? And in this section, what we're looking at is we're looking at the modern work enablement, the goal alignments, the risk alignments, and that's kind of like around those kind of of that core principle, right? The next theme here for our core principles is technology, right? So we want to have like asset-centric security, least privilege, etc. And then there's security controls, and in this we want to keep things simple and pervasive. We want to make it explicit trust validation, right? So I'm ensuring there is no trust by default. And then finally, guardrails and governance, right? And in here, we want to be able to do like things like people guidance, inspiration, reducing risk complexity, doing alignments and automations, and we want to also think about security for the full life cycle, right? And essentially, that is the kind of like zero trust from the open group perspective. And you'll see that there's many different definitions, approaches, views regarding zero trust, and this is one that we discussed in today's module. Thank you.